Hello, friends, and welcome to the Plainview Church of Christ, where all the men are strong, the women are pretty, and the children are above average. We are delighted that you have chosen to be here with us tonight as we have the continuation of your summer series on the topic of evangelism. Now, I want you to know this, that when Gary called me and asked me to speak, I asked him, I said, well, brother, who you got coming to speak? And he told me who the list was. And when he did, I said, well, Gary, why would you want me to come and speak? And he said, well, Greg, we need you here to make the other speakers look good. And so I thank Brother Gary for lowering the bar for me. You know, I kind of feel like that old boy that was asked to preach on a Sunday night, and he went home and he studied and he studied and he prepped and he prepped and he practiced and he practiced, and Sunday night came and he got up and he delivered his lesson. And he felt like he did a pretty good job. He got in the car that night and he was on his way home, and he turned to his wife and he said, you know, I really wonder how many good preachers there are out there. And she looked right back at him and said, well, there's one less than you think. So I will admit to you tonight that I am not a preacher. I am not a son of a preacher. But as my mama used to tell me and my little brother every morning, pretty much at breakfast, she would say, your daddy is a carpenter. Jesus was a carpenter. So remember who you are. So tonight, I'm probably not going to share anything that you haven't heard before, probably nothing new. Solomon said there's nothing new under the sun in Ecclesiastes. But I hope that I can remind us of who we are. Let me see if this thing is working. Great. In Matthew chapter 7, Jesus gives us a promise. He gives us a guarantee. And that guarantee is that if we will seek Him, we will find Him. And unfortunately, in our world, there are too many people for ages and ages that have not sought to know Jesus. They have not sought to have a relationship with Him. And so, as Christians who have the blessed assurance of heaven, it's our responsibility to share the gospel of Christ with those that we know, with our family, and so on. Jesus goes on to say that the road is narrow, the gate is narrow, that leads to life, and few there be that find it. And he says the road and the gate are wide, the road is broad, that leads to destruction, and many there are that find it. So tonight, as we talk about evangelism, I, like many that's in here, you know, I had stuff prepared for our high schoolers tonight, and they're all down at camp, so we're going to kind of switch around a little bit here, adapt. But a lot of you, like me, as we were growing up, you remember that evangelism was revivals that lasted 2 weeks. And we would have one in the spring, and we would have one in the fall. You remember in the 70s when we had the bus ministries? At the little congregation that I went to with my parents, we had 3 buses. We had one that would go and pick up visitors. We had one that would go and pick up some of our older members. And then we had a teenage bus. And so the teenagers in our youth group, we would ride that bus and we would go and we would invite our friends and we would bring them to church on that bus. And we used to have vacation Bible schools that lasted all week long. And most of the day. Retired recently, and I always thought during my working career that why don't older people help out at Vacation Bible School more? And now I know. I mean, I was wore out. I can't tell you. I mean, it had been a long time when I had marched in the infantry, rode in the cavalry, shoot the artillery, and that Rooster Booster song. I don't know why, but I couldn't remember that kids could get that loud. Terry asked me, you know, she said, you know, are you going to volunteer next year after that? I said, yes, I am. I'm a volunteer to sit at the registration desk. But here we are now, we're in 2023. And so things have changed. I watched the videos of your previous three speakers. You know, Ben started out, he did a great job of explaining the why of evangelism. And then you had the two young men that followed him that spoke of the how of evangelism. You know, one of them, he spoke about the ABCs of evangelism. And then the next one, last week, he spoke about evangelism in a digital world. And I admit to you that I am not real tech savvy, but I can tell you that some of the words and the terms and the acronyms they use just went right by me. And I was pining a little bit for some of Brother Hale's cornbread English, just so I could comprehend it. And though they shared with us the new processes and techniques for evangelism, where they were directly in line together was the principle of evangelism, which is sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. And as I listened to them, I thought about, and I don't know why it hit me, but it did, but I thought about cell phones. You know, we live in an iPhone world now, right? You know, when I grew up, our phone hung on the wall. Anybody want to guess where it was hung up at? In the kitchen, right? And it wasn't mobile, but it had a 12-foot cord on it. And that 12-foot cord was so Mama could go to the stove or she could go to the refrigerator. And I know that many of you today, with your technology and your phones, you're kind of concerned a little bit probably about Big Brother and him listening in on your conversations, that being the government. We didn't have that problem, but we had party lines, and that's not party like you think. We had multiple people in our community that was on that same phone line. And we had Miss Gorley that lived next door to us. She didn't have a TV, but so what she would do is about every 10 minutes she would get on that phone, and if you pick up the phone and had a dial tone, you could call someone. But if somebody was on there already, then you just courteously, you just hung up and waited and went back. But Miss Gorley, that's how she spent her day. Every 10 minutes, she'd pick up the phone and she'd listen to them conversations. So if you wanted to know what was going on in our community, you went next door and you talked to Miss Gorley. I'm sure you guys experienced some of that as well. You know, when we were growing up, we weren't allowed, my brother and I, to answer the phone at all. So when that phone would ring, our mama would answer and she'd say, "Hello, Emerson residence." And if me and my brother were kind of being a little rowdy or a little loud and we were running through the kitchen or down a little hall, she could take that receiver and she could throw it and hit us in the back of the head, bring it back like Indiana Jones and say, "Well, yes, Sister Fielder, I'd be glad to bring cookies for VBS." You see, the thing about it is the process changed, but the principle was of communication, right? And even from those days, the process changed to beepers. I mean, I don't know, some of you I'm sure had beepers, at that point in time. My best customer at the time was Chrysler Corporation. And my purchasing agent was Jack Croft's daddy, Tom. And so whenever that beeper would go off, I would look at it, and I guess it meant so much to me. I still remember the number. It was 2104. I knew that Tom wanted to talk to me. But then the process changed again. And I got a bag phone. Anybody ever have a bag phone in here? I mean, that bag phone it had a battery in it that was this big. It was about this thick, and I was convinced it was made out of uranium because it would get so hot it would burn your seats. And it was so big you felt like you could just pick it up and call in an airstrike in another part of the world. But then the process changed again. And when the process changed again, we got the little small cell phones. And then you weren't paying 27 cents a minute to talk on it. All the prices, they came down. And now today, so many of you here today, you have the latest and greatest iPhone. And I don't know, maybe, I have a Droid, so maybe you're up to iPhone 27. But the point I'm trying to make is that the processes change, but the principle remains the same. I graduated in 1975 from Willard, Missouri, and I left in the fall of 75 to go to Harding College in Searcy, Arkansas. And I know a bunch of you are saying, well, hey, Harding is a university. You know, I get it. It wasn't back then. It was a college. But when I got ready to leave, my daddy, he brought me, and you remember these, a map that unfolded and unfolded and unfolded and unfolded till it was like 3 by 3. And he had drawn on it. And it was he said, this is the way that you go, son. And then just as I got in the car, he handed me $2 and said, when you get to Arkansas, stop at a station and buy you another one and then figure out how to get there. Today, you speak into your cell phone. You tell it an address. It will tell you not only how to get there, it'll tell you every turn to take. It'll tell you if there's a traffic issue or something like that. And when you get there, it'll even tell you you arrived. The process has changed. The principle was the same, that we wanted directions on where to go. And so though the process or the techniques of evangelism has changed, the principles are still the same. Jesus is still the same yesterday, today, and forever. And that's the principle that you and I can rely on and that we depend on. But when it comes to talking about evangelism, it makes a lot of us uncomfortable, doesn't it? You know, we kind of think evangelism is for the pros. It's for Ben, and it's for Christian. It's, you know, it's the preachers, or it's for the elders. You know, it's for Albie and Davey and Jay and James and Steve. Or maybe we think it's for the guy standing back there in the hole. It's for the evangelism deacon, Gary Bailey. But you see, God has a plan for our life. And that plan that he has, you know, I kind of missed that. I put the different one up there. No, they didn't. Let me go back one. Does it go back? Don't we sometimes lean on this scripture right here? Don't we sometimes say, you know, I'm too young for evangelism, or I'm afraid that I will mess up, or, you know, I may not know an answer. You know, you fill in the blank. Fill in the blank. My notes got out of order here. I apologize. And so maybe some of us, we will say that I just don't think that I can do that. And I want you to know that I get it. I do. I really get it. We all come from different backgrounds. God has blessed us with different talents and different abilities. And so I get that. I mean, when some people meet me, they think that John Connolly wrote that song, I'm just a common man, I drive a common van, my dog ain't got a pedigree. But the thing is that God has a plan for my life and for yours. It looks like we're missing a slide. So when we read the words of Jesus concerning what we call the Great Commission, that means that God has a plan for my life, and he has a plan for yours. And that is for us to share, to tell the good news of Jesus Christ. You know, I liked how that speaker last week described that verse. He said, as you are going about, share the good news of Jesus. As you're going to school or to work or to Walmart or to Grinders, well, whatever it is next door. As you are going about, share the good news of Jesus. And I have found that one of the best ways that for me and that for a lot of us to be able to do this is that if we will try to daily walk in the footsteps of Jesus, if we will do our best to try to live the traits that Jesus demonstrated for us, of being kind, of being patient, of being loving, of being supportive. Several years ago, I got on an airplane somewhere in America, and I was headed to Atlanta, Georgia. And when I got on the plane, it was one of those little regional jets, so it only had one row on this side and two rows on this side. And I took my seat. It was in 2B. It was an aisle seat. But in the front row, there was a little, about 8-year-old boy that was sitting in the window seat. And as he was sitting there, he just kept looking out the window. He wouldn't look at anybody that was getting on the plane. And so I thought, he don't look like he's scared to fly, but he looks like he's a little bit nervous. So I was going to watch him. Well, they closed the doors to the plane. The flight attendant, she came out and she went through her safety precautions with all of us, which most of us don't listen to, but she went through all of that. And then as the plane was getting ready to taxi to take off, instead of sitting in the jump seat like they normally do, she sat down next to this little boy. And so she started to talk to him. She asked him what his name was. She told him her name. She asked him how old he was. That's how I knew he was 8. She asked him where he was going. He was going to Atlanta to see his grandparents. And they just kind of kept talking back and forth. And pretty soon you could tell they were beginning to be fast friends. Well, we got up to altitude, and she needed to get up, and she needed to go do her flight duties. And so as she got her cart and she started to come down, of course, he was in the first row. And she gave him a can of Pringles and banana, cookies, a Coke, peanuts. And then she came to me and she gave me water and a bag of peanuts. But what I found so neat was that as she went down through there, he leaned way over there on the other side of that seat so he could watch his new friend. And it put a smile on my face. Well, we went ahead through our flight, and as we started our descent, she came and she sat down next to this little guy again. Only this time when she sat down, a little pair of plastic airplane wings that she put on his shirt. You'd have thought she had just given him $1 million. He was grinning from ear to ear. And they just sat there and they kept having this conversation, and it was just wonderful. And so we got to Atlanta, we landed, and we went up to the gate. And any of you that fly know that when that plane goes beep, everybody jumps up, right? You want to get out of your seats, you want to get your luggage, you want to get off this flying gas can, right? So as we got up and was standing to leave, she knocked on the door of the cockpit. And so pilots opened the door, and she let this little boy climb up in there amongst the pilots, and his eyes were this big. He was looking at all the lights and the switches and the gauges. Him and the pilots were comparing their wings with each other. It was pretty cool. But finally the door opened to the plane, and there was an attendant there that was going to escort him to see his parents. As I got off that plane, I said to that flight attendant, "Thank you for being so kind to that little boy." And she looked at me and she said, "Well, sir, if he would have been my little boy, I would have hoped someone would have been kind to him too." I mean, that got me. I'm walking up that jet bridge, I got goosebumps on my arms because I realized I had just met someone that not only knew the golden rule, but lived it. And she inspired me to go out that day and to find someone to be kind to, extra kind. And that's kind of a neat little story. But as Paul Harvey would say, now for the rest of the story, and you guys can Google Paul Harvey later. But as I followed that attendant and that young man through the airport, we got to about 20 yards from security, and he took off in a run. He saw his grandparents. So he ran to them. They both dropped down to a knee, and they just had this big old family hug right there in the airport. And I just had to pull over and park. I wanted to watch this. And as they were there together, his little mouth was going a mile a minute. He was telling them everything about the airplane, about the cockpit. He was talking about his wings. Their eyes were wide open. They were smiling. And I don't know, maybe it's because that I had recently become a grandparent myself. But I thought about, I bet they prayed to God and asked him to protect their grandson, to keep him safe, to help him not to be scared. And as they knelt there amongst each other, holding each other, I knew that they knew that God had answered their prayers. But what they may never know is that God used a flight attendant to answer those prayers. And that's what you and I can do. God can use us to be a blessing to people that are seeking to know Him and to be able to share the story of Jesus with them. You know, I saw a stat recently that stated this. It said that most of the baptisms in our churches today are our kids. And so all of you that have been Bible school teachers, I want you to know that you do evangelism. You do evangelism because you're teaching them the story of Jesus. And that's important. You know, older men in this congregation, you know, I don't have all those kids here to tell them something, but older men in the congregation, when you see one of our young men get up here and they lead a song, lead a prayer, do a devo, when services are over, go up to them and shake their hand. Tell them they did a great job, because you see, chances are they've grown up right over here watching you get up here and do those same things. And they're just emulating you now. And it could be that it's your words and your actions that encourage them to get back up here and do it again. Older women. Everybody needs another grandma. I know that I wouldn't be standing up here in front of you tonight at 65 years old if it weren't for all the grandmas in my life. In fact, so many of you here have encouraged me. You've patted me on the back. You've sent me cards. You just do what you do. You go to these young kids, parents, especially the ones that have little ones that they're wrestling with, and you tell those parents they're doing a good job. You compliment them about their children. Because I am convinced that some of the, and this is, I can talk personally about this, some of the most best blessings in my life has come from grandmas. And that's what we can do to make a difference right here within our own congregation. You know, I understand that next week Harrison's going to be speaking to you. You know, Harrison has been very fortunate. He has great parents, great grandparents. But I'm reminded of that children's poem that I'd rather see a sermon than hear one any day. I'd rather one would walk with me than merely show the way. And so many of you, he has seen those sermons while he's grown up right here within this church. And I'm sure next week there's going to be a bunch of smiles in here, and there's going to be some glint in the eye, knowing that you had a part in his spiritual growth. Can you look around this room tonight? I know you can. And look around and see Christians that you respect. I don't know what time it is. That you can respect, that you admire. People that in this church that has helped you, they have taught you, they have shared with you the gospel of Christ, and you have grown and you have benefited. They have comforted you. They have been there for you. You know, I'm standing here in front of you tonight. I'm wearing cowboy boots, but I'm wearing a very special pair of socks. Over 20-something years ago, we raised two boys, you know, Drew and Josh, and Miss Terry went out and she bought each one of us 2 pair of black gold toe dress socks. And on Sunday mornings, I would get up, get ready to come to church. I would go to my sock drawer, and I would have no socks. Them boys had done robbed me during the week. And it caused problems for us on Sunday mornings a lot of times because, and a lot of it was my fault because I'd be aggravated at them and I'd get after them and whatnot when we were supposed to be getting ready to go to church, going to worship. And I had not helped them to keep their focus. But 3G found out about that, and she came and got our socks, and she sewed into our socks our initials. And we never had that problem again. God had used 3G to bless our life. I know I'm looking around, some of you are going like, well, who's 3G? Well, it's sweet Georgia Muirhead. I can't even look at her or I'll cry. Her sweet kindness to our family was God's blessing that He used her to bless our family. I know a lot of you know her by Gigi, right? Now you know she's got great grandkids, so now she's 3G. I gave her that name. When I became a grandparent, my wife told me I had to pick out my name, what I wanted them to call me. And you know what I picked, right? I picked Gigi. Because Gigi is one of the grandmas in my life that has been there for us, for my family, and has been a blessing. And I know that you can look around this room tonight and see how many people in here that have blessed your life. You know, I learned so much here. Not just about my spirituality, not just about what the scriptures themselves said, but I learned a lot from folks in here that taught me how to do my job better. Any of you that has ever been in Leroy Jarrett's class know that he was always prepared, that he always stayed on target. It was always going to be scriptural. But we would have a visitor once in a while or someone, and they would raise their hand. They'd want to make a comment. And Leroy would be patient. He would call on them, let them make their comment. And sometimes them comments went this way, and sometimes they went this way. But Leroy would always, at the end of their comments, he would say, you know what? I never really thought about it that way. And then he would just go on right with his lesson, staying on topic. He never offended someone. He never made them feel like they were unwelcome in our church. He never made them feel like they weren't important. And I took that and I applied that to my sales job when I was dealing with customers. And I can see Jim Steelman back there, and he's laughing. If you've been in Jim Steelman's class, you know that Jim's very smart. He knows the scriptures. But what I learned from Jim is that it's okay to have a little humor in your class, because that makes people comfortable and it keeps them engaged. Again, there's so many people in this church that you can draw on, that you can make an impact on, especially with our youngsters. You know, I look over here and I see Ty Stafford and him and Casey. You know, I knew them when they were yahoos. And now they have turned into husbands, fathers, still faithful to God, raising their family that way. And so many of you have been an encouragement and an impact to him and to Casey as well. I guess what I'm trying to say tonight is that in our Christian walk, every move we make, every action we take matters. Not just to our family, not just to our church family, not just to people we work or go to school with, but to everyone and for all time. And I can prove it. Several years ago, I went to L.A. to do some business. Now, most of you know L.A. just means Lower Alabama, right? So I was down there in Gulf Shores, and I was found me, it was lunchtime, I found a little cafe, I sat down in there, and as soon as I sat down, this lady, the waitress came, and she just flopped a menu down right in front of me, never even looked at me, took a pencil out of her hair bun, and she had her pad out, and so she had a name tag, and it said Dolores. So I said, well, Dolores, I've never been here before. Would you recommend something for me that's good here? And she looked at me, kind of took back, and she said, well, our hamburger steak and mashed potatoes are pretty good. And I said, well, that's great. That's fantastic, Dolores. That's exactly what I'll have. And she gave me a smile. I was sitting on a stool at the counter between two guys. And this guy that was sitting on my right side, he had a little notebook out, and he's writing in it. And when he's writing in it, he starts giggling a little bit. And then he kind of broke out into a little laugh, and I looked at him, and he looked at me, and he said, well done. I said, excuse me? He said, Dolores has been working here for over 20 years, and she don't smile at anybody, and you got a genuine smile out of her. Well done. I kind of whispered to him, well, I thought if I was nice, hopefully she'd give me some more mashed potatoes. Well, he finished his meal, and he put his money up on the counter, and he got up, he stuck his arm out to shake my hand. He said, hi, my name's Andy. He said, it's been great to meet you today. I said, well, Andy, I'm Greg. You have a great day. And he turned around and he left. Well, just not even a minute later, Dolores comes back and she's laid my plate down. Are we done? Did it shut off? She lays my plate down in front of me. And she said, did you know who that guy was you were talking to? I said, no. He said his name was Andy. She goes, well, his name is Andy Andrews. And Andy is a well-known speaker. He's wrote a lot of books. He's really famous down here. I said, well, he seemed like a nice guy to me. So I went about my business. And I know you all are wondering, did I get extra mashed potatoes, right? Well, I'll tell you this. My wife will tell you, my belly will show you that I really like mashed potatoes. But that day, when I left, there were still 2 scoops of potatoes on that plate. So guys, it pays to be nice. Went back to the room that night. I looked Andy up on the computer. And sure enough, he was. He wrote a lot of books. He's given a lot of talks. And so I bought his books. And me and Miss Terry, we've read them. And I promise you that, you will enjoy reading them if you were to buy one of his books. But one of his books, he had a story that proves this point for me. That everything we say and everything we do matters, and this was it. He called it the butterfly effect. Have you heard of it? The butterfly effect? See, the butterfly effect was a doctoral thesis written in 1962 by a man by the name of Edward Lorenz, who presented it at the New York Academy of Sciences. And what the butterfly effect stated was that a butterfly could be right over here on this side of the world and could start flapping its wings. And those wings would move molecules of air, which would move more molecules of air, more molecules of air, until way over here on the other side of the earth, it could start a hurricane. It was crazy, but it was interesting. And because it was interesting, it hung around for years in comic books and bad movies, and it kind of became urban legend until in the 90s, some physicists discovered that the butterfly effect is real and that it works every time. And they even gave it the status of a law, like the law of gravity. Andy was telling me that, as I read this, he was saying that he was in a hotel room one night, and a lot of you older folks will remember on ABC, the news anchor was Peter Jennings, and he had a segment on Friday nights where he would come on and he would have this segment that was called Person of the Week. And they might tell you about someone that did something famous or heroic, or maybe it was about a little old lady somewhere in Iowa that just turned 110 years old. But whoever it was that they chose, they would be Person of the Week. And so Andy said he was in his room, he was ironing the left sleeve of a white shirt when he heard on the TV going on, and he said, Peter Jennings went, the Person of the Week, and he gave the date, was Norman Borlaug. And he said, Norman Borlaug? He knew who Norman Borlaug was. Norman Borlaug is his work hybridizing wheat and corn in arid climate, he had been credited with saving from death and starvation over 2 billion people. 2 billion people. I mean, his work, they were able to grow wheat and corn in the deserts of the Sahara Desert, or in our great Southwest, in West Texas and New Mexico. He won a Nobel Prize. He saved 2 billion people. And for that, he was Person of the Week. Unless it was a guy by the name of Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace was vice president to Roosevelt. And some of you are going, wait a minute, now Truman was his vice president. And you'd be right, but don't forget, Roosevelt served 4 terms. He had 3 vice presidents. In the middle vice president was this Secretary of Agriculture, this Henry Wallace. And so Henry Wallace, using the status of his position as vice president, he opened a station in New Mexico whose sole purpose was to hybridize wheat and corn for arid climates. And he hired a young man named Norman Borlaug to run it. So when you think about it, maybe it was Henry Wallace that saved the 2 billion people. And maybe it was Henry Wallace who should have been Person of the Week. Unless it was George Washington Carver. You guys remember Carver, don't you? They teach it to you in school. I mean, you remember him, the peanut stuff? One thing people don't know about George Washington Carver is that when he was 19 years old and a student at Iowa State University, that he had a dairy science professor that thought so much of this young college student that he would let his little 6-year-old boy go out on Saturdays and Sunday afternoons with this bright student, and they would go on botanical expeditions. And he would teach this young guy about how the seeds and how sun and the dirt and the rain and all this with photosynthesis worked. I mean, the peanut stuff. I mean, George Washington Carver was flapping his wings on this peanuts, and he developed 266 things from the peanuts that we still use today. And he flapped his wings on the sweet potato. 88 things that he developed from the sweet potato that we still use today. And while nobody else was looking, he was just flapping his wings on this little 6-year-old Henry Wallace and putting his life in a direction to understand and have a passion for the plants and for agriculture. So when you think about it, maybe it was George Washington Carver that saved the 2 billion people and should have been Person of the Week. Unless it was a farmer from Diamond, Missouri, a man named Moses. He lived in a slave state, but he didn't believe in slavery. Well, one cold night in January, a bunch of these psychopaths from Montrell's Raiders, they come riding into his community, and they started burning down everybody's buildings and their homes and their barns, and they would take their livestock, and they even took people. And that night they took a lady by the name of Mary Washington, who, as they grabbed her, grabbed a hold of her infant son, George, and they took off. Well, this was a real problem for Moses because Mary was Susan's best friend. And so together they started sending out word any way they could, messengers, any way they could, trying to get word to Quantrill's Raiders that he still had one big horse on his farm and he would trade it for Mary and her baby. 48 hours later, they had a meeting set up. And so Moses, he got on his horse and he rode it several hours north to a crossroads in Kansas. He was there at the appointed time when 4 of Quantrill's Raiders showed up on horseback. I mean, it was cold. The steam was coming off of the horses. They had their torches with them. They had their flour sacks over their head with their eye holes cut out. And they come up there and they took the only horse that Moses had left on his farm, for which they threw him a burlap bag. And he went and he caught that bag. And he went down and he put it on the ground and he opened it up. And inside there was a cold, starving, almost dead baby boy. And so he opened his jacket and he opened his shirts and he pulled that baby up and he held him up against his skin to keep him warm. And he walked him out. All along telling him about his mama, about what a great lady she was, fully knowing that she was probably already dead. And he told him how he and his wife Susan would raise him as their own, that they would clothe him, that they would feed him, and that they would educate him. And then he told him that he would give him his name. And that's how Moses and Susan Carver became the parents of that little baby, George Washington. So when you think about it, maybe it was a farmer and his wife from Diamond, Missouri that saved the 2 billion people and counting. Unless, and you know, we could go on all night doing this. How far back in history could we go to see what person did what action or what did something that changed the lives of billions of people? And how far forward can we go in your life to see what you do today and how it can affect people? I mean, I am convinced that there are generations yet to be born who will be shaped and molded because of what you say or what you do today or tomorrow or the next day or the next day or the next. Because everything we say and everything we do matters. Aren't you glad somebody shared the good news of the gospel of Christ with you? That you sat here tonight and you're comforted in the fact that you have the blessed assurance of heaven. And that you hope that God will send someone that's seeking him to you, your way, so that you can share that news with them. Maybe you're here tonight and you've been coming to church here, you've been listening to Ben's sermons, you've been in classes, you've been studying on your own. You have been seeking to know Jesus. And you have come to that point where the door is opened. And if you come tonight and you will repent of your sins, and you will confess that Jesus is your Lord, we will baptize you into the family of God. And if you're here tonight and you've got something on your heart that's bothering you, or you have something that you need help with, you're at Plainview. You're at Plainview. And this church family loves you. And they would love to pray with you tonight. And then they will be there for you tomorrow. And the next day. And the next day. And the next day. Because we're family. If we can help you tonight, won't you come as we stand and sing?